The gavel struck the wooden bench like a gunshot, and every soul in the Redemption Creek courthouse held their breath. "Order," Judge Harlan Cobb said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years on the bench and not a single day of mercy. He was a gaunt man with a silver beard and eyes the color of storm clouds, and he looked down at the woman standing in the defendant's box as though she were already buried. "The court has heard the evidence. The court has heard the testimony. And the court finds itself in need of one final statement before it renders its verdict." Adelaide Farrow stood with her chin raised and her hands bound in iron cuffs that bit into her wrists. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a dusty traveling hat, and a pair of green eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty to blink easily at any of it. She wore a pale blue dress that was torn at the hem from 3 days of hard riding, and there was a bruise along her jaw that nobody in the courtroom seemed particularly interested in explaining. She did not look like a murderer. But then, the man accusing her of being one was the most powerful cattle baron in 3 counties, and in 1882 in the territory of New Mexico, that counted for considerably more than looking innocent. "Has the defendant anything to say in her own defense?" Judge Cobb asked. Adelaide opened her mouth, and the prosecuting attorney, a slick man named Dillard who had ridden down from Santa Fe in a pressed suit, immediately rose to his feet. "Your Honor, the defendant has already been given ample opportunity to," I said. The judge repeated, his gaze cutting sideways. "Has the defendant anything to say?" Adelaide swallowed. The courtroom was packed to the walls with ranchers, townspeople, and a row of hard-faced men who worked for Victor Crane, the man she was accused of killing. Crane's widow sat in the front row in expensive black silk, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. None of it was real. Adelaide knew it, and somewhere in the back of her mind, she had begun to accept that knowing the truth and being able to prove the truth were 2 entirely different things, and that the distance between them was going to cost her her life. She drew in a breath to speak. And then the door at the back of the courthouse slammed open. Every head in the room turned. The afternoon light poured through the doorway in a long, golden rectangle, and inside that rectangle stood a tall man in a deputy's badge and a dust-covered coat, breathing hard, like he had ridden very fast and very far to get to this exact moment. His hat was pulled low, and his jaw was set with the kind of determination that does not come from righteousness alone, but from something older and fiercer and more dangerous than righteousness. It comes from love. Deputy James Aldridge walked down the center aisle of that courthouse like a man walking through fire, and he did not stop until he reached the front, until he stood directly before the elevated bench where Judge Harlan Cobb sat with one hand already reaching for his gavel. James's chest heaved once. He pulled off his hat, and in a voice that carried to every corner of that room and silenced every whisper within it, he said what no one in Redemption Creek had expected to hear from the most loyal lawman the territory had ever known. "I will vouch for her with my name." The silence that followed was absolute. Adelaide Farrow turned to look at him, and something cracked open behind her eyes, something raw and terrified and overwhelmingly grateful, and she pressed her lips together hard to keep from making a sound. Judge Cobb leaned forward slowly. "Deputy Aldridge," he said, "you understand what you are doing?" "Yes, sir," James said. "I do." "You understand that vouching for this woman, putting your name and your badge and your reputation behind her claim of innocence, means that if this court finds reason to doubt her—" "Then the doubt falls on me," James said. "Yes, sir, I understand." But to understand why James Aldridge would walk into a packed courtroom and put everything he had on the line for a woman who had ridden into Redemption Creek only 6 weeks before. You have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the morning she arrived, and the afternoon he first heard her name, and the long, slow, burning weeks between then and now when everything James believed about his life was quietly rewritten by a woman he had no business falling in love with. It was a Tuesday in early October of 1882, when Adelaide Farrow rode into Redemption Creek on a chestnut mare with a broken saddle strap and a canvas bag tied to the back with a leather cord. The town sat in a shallow valley at the base of the San Andres Mountains, and it was the kind of town that had been almost prosperous once and was currently trying to remember what that had felt like. There was a general store, a hotel with 6 rooms, a saloon, a barber shop, a small church at the end of the main street, and a jailhouse and sheriff's office combination that took up the corner lot nearest to the livery stable. James Aldridge was sitting on the porch of the jailhouse drinking coffee and going over a stack of wanted notices when the woman rode past. He noticed her the way he noticed most things, quietly, without obvious reaction, cataloging details with a habitual precision. The saddle strap was broken on the left side. The canvas bag was well packed and efficiently tied. The horse was in good condition despite the trail dust. The rider sat straight despite what had clearly been a long journey. She wore practical clothes, a divided riding skirt and a plain cotton blouse, and she did not look around the town with the wide-eyed wariness of someone who had never seen hard country. She looked around with the calm assessment of someone taking note of exits. He was mildly interested, and then he went back to his wanted notices. He saw her again that afternoon at the general store. She was buying supplies, a modest collection, enough for a week or two of self-sufficient living. And she was speaking to Elmer Pitts, who owned the store, with a directness that Elmer visibly found unnerving. Elmer was not accustomed to women who stated their needs plainly and did not pad them with apology or decoration. "I need to know if there's any land available for lease in the valley east of town," she said. "Short term. I have a skill that could benefit the community and I'm looking for a place to set up properly." "And what skill would that be?" Elmer asked, in the tone of a man who doubted women generally had skills beyond the domestic sphere. "I'm a doctor," Adelaide said. James, who was standing at the far end of the counter looking for a specific tin of tobacco, paused with his hand on the shelf. Elmer blinked. "A doctor." "A physician," Adelaide confirmed. "Trained in St. Louis. I have my credentials if you'd like to see them." "Now, miss." "It is Miss Farrow," she said, and her voice had an edge to it, not unkind but absolutely firm, the voice of a person who had repeated this particular clarification many times and was determined to make it land. "And I am fully qualified. I can show you letters of recommendation from the Missouri Medical College and from 2 hospitals where I completed my training. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking about available land." James set down the tin he was holding and said, from across the store, "Harkin's place east of the creek is sitting empty. He left last spring. You could speak to the land office about it." Adelaide turned and looked at him with those green eyes, and something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated, the way a compass needle settles. He was in his deputy's coat with his badge on and his hat pushed back, and he looked like what he was, a lawman, mid-30s, lean and weathered, with brown hair going slightly gray at the temples and a face that was not handsome in any dramatic way, but that was deeply honest, the kind of face you trusted without knowing why. "Thank you," she said. "James Aldridge," he said. "Deputy. If you need an introduction to the land office, I can write you a letter." There was a brief pause, and he saw her weigh it, the offer, what it might cost her, what it might obligate her to. Then she said, "I appreciate that." "You're welcome, Miss Farrow." He would think about that exchange later in the weeks that followed and marvel at how quiet and ordinary it had seemed. Two people in a general store, an offer of a letter, a polite acceptance. Nothing about it had felt like the beginning of something that would end with him standing in a courthouse, staking his name on her innocence. But that was the nature of beginnings. They never announced themselves. The land office letter was written and delivered the following morning. Adelaide Farrow leased the Harkin property on a 3-month arrangement, and within a week, she had set up a modest medical practice in the front room of the house. It was a small operation, a table, a set of instruments she kept in a leather case, a cabinet of medicines and tinctures she had brought with her, and a hand-lettered sign on the fence post that said Physician Adelaide Farrow, open 8 to 5. The town was skeptical. It would be dishonest to say otherwise. In 1882, in a rural New Mexico territory, a woman practicing medicine was not something people accepted easily, even people who needed medical attention. There were murmurs. There were pointed conversations at the saloon. There were women who told their husbands they would rather bleed than be examined by a female doctor, and husbands who agreed, and then developed mysterious complaints that somehow required them to visit the Harkin property alone. James rode past the property on his daily patrol route. He told himself this was standard practice. He patrolled the eastern part of town every morning, and he was not particularly interested in monitoring what the new physician was doing. He was, of course, lying to himself, but he was doing it sincerely. On the 4th day, he stopped because her fence gate was open and swinging in the wind, which was a security matter and therefore within his purview. He dismounted, closed the gate, and then stood there for a moment listening to the sounds from inside the house, voices, low and purposeful, the clink of instruments. He was about to leave when the door opened, and Adelaide stepped out with a basin of soapy water that she carried to the edge of the porch to empty, and she looked up and saw him standing by the gate like a man who had absolutely no reason to be there. "Deputy Aldridge," she said. "Gate was open," he said. She looked at the gate, which was now closed. Then she looked at him. There was something in her expression that was very close to amusement but was working hard at pretending to be neutral. "I see," she said. "Thank you, you're welcome." He picked up his horse's reins and did not move. "How is the practice?" "Mrs. Gurney came in this morning with a wrist she's been carrying wrong for 2 months, Adelaide said. The bone was healing crooked. It needed to be broken again and reset. She was very unhappy with me for about 20 minutes and then she thanked me. She'll thank you properly in about 6 weeks when she can use it again," James said. "Mrs. Gurney plays the piano at the church. She's been in considerable distress about not being able to play." Adelaide looked at him with those calculating green eyes. "You know this town well." 11 years, he said. "Is that how long you've been the deputy?" "The last 7. 4 years before that I was just a ranch hand who the sheriff occasionally asked to help out when things got complicated." He paused. "It got complicated fairly often." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. "I imagine it does," she said. He climbed back onto his horse. He told himself he was going because he had a patrol route. He went because he had a patrol route. He also went because staying any longer would have made it obvious that he had stopped for reasons that had nothing to do with the fence gate. And James Aldridge prided himself on his honesty, which meant he found it considerably easier to avoid situations that might require him to be dishonest than to simply be dishonest in them. Victor Crane was the reason things became complicated. Crane was 51 years old and owned the 3 largest ranches in the county. He was the kind of man who had decided early in life that success was a matter of eliminating competition rather than improving himself. And he had applied this philosophy with remarkable consistency across 4 decades. He had a wife, Eleanor, who wore expensive dresses and looked through people she considered beneath her. He had a foreman named Booth Ragland, who was broad-shouldered and cold-eyed, and did what he was told without asking why. And he had a long history of acquiring land and water rights through means that were technically legal only in the loosest interpretation of the word. He had also, 8 years before, acquired a silver mine in the hills north of town, which was currently producing more silver than anything else in the county, and which had made him extraordinarily wealthy and extraordinarily untouchable. James had his own complicated history with Victor Crane. He had watched Crane pressure small ranchers off their land for years, accumulating property the way other men accumulated debt, methodically, without sentiment, always within a distance of the law that made prosecution nearly impossible. He had filed reports. He had submitted complaints to the territorial marshal's office. He had spoken to the county judge, who was not the same judge as the one who would eventually preside over Adelaide's trial, and he had been told, politely but very firmly, that without direct evidence of criminal wrongdoing, there was nothing to be done. James had kept the reports. He had kept all of them, 11 years of them, in a box under the desk in the jailhouse office, because James Aldridge was the kind of man who believed in records, even when records produced no immediate results. Adelaide first encountered Victor Crane 3 weeks after arriving in Redemption Creek, when he came to her medical practice on a Thursday morning without an appointment. He was a big man, not tall but wide and solid, with a thick gray mustache and the look of someone who had never in his life been told that an appointment was required. He walked in as though the building already belonged to him, which was, Adelaide would later understand how he walked into every building. She was examining old Mr. Finch's gout when Crane arrived, and she told him, through the closed door, that she would be with him in 20 minutes. He did not like this. He sat down in the waiting chair and radiated displeasure like a stove radiates heat. When she came out, she asked him what she could do for him. He looked at her with the kind of slow assessment that was not medical and was not friendly, and he said, "You're the woman doctor." "I am a physician, yes," Adelaide said. "What seems to be the trouble?" "I have a headache that won't quit," he said. 2 weeks now. My wife thinks I need bleeding. I think she's wrong." "She is wrong," Adelaide said, because bloodletting had been broadly discredited and she had no patience for it. "Sit down here. Let me look at your eyes." She examined him. She was professional and thorough, because she was always professional and thorough, and she asked him about his diet, his sleep, whether he had any changes in his vision. She noticed that his blood pressure was elevated. She could determine this by feel and observation in ways that a modern physician would supplement with instruments. But the instruments she carried from St. Louis were already considerably more advanced than what most frontier practitioners used. She prescribed him a reduction in alcohol, an increase in water, and a specific herbal preparation she kept in stock. She told him to come back in 2 weeks. He looked at her prescription with a skeptical expression. Then he looked at her. "You're good," he said, as though this surprised him. "Yes," she said, because it was true. "I might have use for a physician at my ranch," he said. "My workers get injuries. Having someone nearby instead of waiting for a doctor from Las Cruces would save me considerable time. I would pay well." Adelaide met his eyes steadily. There was something behind them that she did not like, an assumption of ownership, subtle but real. "I have a practice here," she said. "I'm available to any patient who comes to me. If your workers need treatment, they're welcome to come." I was thinking of something more exclusive, Crane said. Then you'll need to look elsewhere, Adelaide said pleasantly. I treat everyone. Crane studied her for a long moment. Then he stood and put his hat on. You're new here, he said, in the tone of someone offering a warning that was taking great pains to sound like simple observation. You'll learn how things work in this valley. I'm sure I will, Adelaide said. That will be $2 for the consultation. He paid. He left. And Adelaide stood at her window and watched his horse and buggy disappear down the road toward town. And she felt, with a physician's trained instinct, that she had just been told something important, even if she could not yet identify exactly what it was. James heard about the visit from Elmer Pitts, who heard about it from Mrs. Gurney, who had been walking past Adelaide's property when Crane's buggy was pulling away. News moved faster than horses in Redemption Creek. By the time it reached James, it had acquired a few embellishments he suspected were not accurate, but the core of it, Crane had gone to the new doctor. She had treated him politely but firmly, and he had left in a mood rang completely true. He went to check on her. He told himself this was professional. He was the deputy. Part of his duty was monitoring situations that could escalate. Adelaide was sitting on her porch in the late afternoon light, making notes in a small leather journal when he rode up. She looked up without surprise, which meant she had heard the horse, which meant she was always paying attention. He was starting to notice things like that. Victor Crane came to see you, he said. He did, she said. And you've come to tell me something about him that you think I should know. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. May I sit? She gestured to the chair on the other end of the porch. He tied his horse to the fence post and sat down and was quiet for a moment, arranging words. Crane has significant influence in this county, he said. He uses it. He has used it to acquire things that didn't belong to him and to eliminate people who inconvenienced him. Not with violence, usually. He's too careful for that. But with pressure, legal maneuvering, manufactured debts, complaints to authorities. He has a talent for making things difficult for people who don't accommodate him. Adelaide looked at him directly. Are you telling me I should have accommodated him? I'm telling you to be careful, James said, and to document everything. Anything he says to you, any interaction. Write it down with the date. She held up her small leather journal. I already am. He felt something shift in his chest, a warmth, a recognition. Good, he said. Why are you telling me this? She asked. You could have let me find out the hard way. He considered the question honestly. Because you're doing something this town needs, he said. And because it seems unfair that you should have to navigate something dangerous without at least being warned it's there. She studied him with those steady eyes for what felt like a long time. The late afternoon light was turning the mountains the color of old copper. A quail called somewhere in the brush along the creek. The moment had a particular weight to it, the weight of honesty offered and received, of two careful people deciding to trust, just slightly, just enough. Thank you, she said finally. James. It was the first time she had used his first name. He noticed this. He suspected she noticed that he noticed. October passed into November. The days shortened and turned cold in the way of high desert autumn. Brilliant during the days, sharp and clear at night, with frost on the ground some mornings that was gone by 10 o'clock. Adelaide's practice grew. The town was warming to her, slowly, in the sideways fashion of rural communities that resist change until they decide they've always been comfortable with it. 3 more women came as patients. 2 cowboys from the outlying ranches came in with injuries. A child with a bad fever was brought in by a desperate mother at 2 in the morning, and Adelaide kept the child alive through a night that nearly broke the mother's heart. And by morning the fever broke. and the mother sat at Adelaide's kitchen table crying with relief and said, "I don't care what anybody says. You are a gift from God Almighty." James heard this story too, and something in him that had been very carefully maintained at a controlled professional distance quietly, and without permission gave way. He began stopping by in the evenings, not every evening, 3 or 4 times a week. He would come around 6 o'clock when her appointments were done, and they would sit on the porch if it was warm enough or at her kitchen table if it wasn't, and they would talk. They talked about everything. About medicine. She explained things to him with the enthusiasm of someone who loved her work deeply and rarely got to discuss it, and he listened with genuine attention. About the law, he explained the particular challenges of maintaining order in a territory where the legal framework was still being constructed, while the human impulse toward chaos operated at full capacity. About their lives before this town. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a physician who had taught her medicine while everyone around them insisted it was inappropriate for a girl to learn such things. She had been to St. Louis, to the medical college, to the hospitals. She had worked in difficult conditions. She had fought for every credential. She did not say this with bitterness, but with a matter-of-fact clarity that he found, if anything, more striking than bitterness would have been. He had grown up in Texas, the youngest of 4 brothers, on a farm that failed slowly over the course of his childhood. He had drifted west in his early 20s, done various kinds of work, ended up in Redemption Creek during a particularly bad winter when the sheriff had needed an extra hand, and he had needed a steady paycheck. He had stayed because it felt like a place that needed staying in, a place where someone's presence made a difference. "You like it?" she asked him one evening. "Being a lawman," he thought about it. "Most days," he said. "There are days when I wonder if it accomplishes anything. When I watch someone like Crane operate and I can't touch him." "But you keep filing the reports," she said. He had told her about the box under the desk. He was not sure why he had told her, except that she had a way of listening that made it feel safe to say true things. "I keep filing the reports," he confirmed. "That matters," she said. "Even when it doesn't seem like it does. Records matter. Evidence matters. The truth has a way of accumulating until it can't be ignored." He looked at her across the kitchen table in the light of the oil lamp, and he thought, "I am in very serious trouble with this woman." He thought it clearly and calmly, the way you observe a fact that changes your life. He did not say anything out loud. He was not yet ready to say anything out loud. In the 3rd week of November, one of Crane's ranch hands came to Adelaide's practice with a broken collarbone. He was a young man, maybe 20 years old, nervous and in clear pain, and he said the injury had happened from a fall. Adelaide set the bone and wrapped it, and said nothing about the bruising pattern around the injury that was inconsistent with a fall and very consistent with having been struck by something. But she wrote it down in her journal, date and all. 2 days later, another ranch hand came in with a cut on his scalp that needed stitching. He also said he'd fallen. Adelaide stitched the cut and wrote it down. She mentioned this to James. He had already seen the men at the saloon afterward, had noted their furtive expressions and their unwillingness to speak directly, and had formed his own conclusions. "Crane uses Booth Ragland to keep his workers in line," James said. "Ragland is not a gentle man." "They're afraid of him," Adelaide said. "They have reason to be." She pressed her lips together. "Someone is going to be seriously hurt, or worse," James said, "and there will be nothing to trace it to Crane." "Unless someone keeps records," she said. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and between them passed a mutual and complete understanding. This was when he first began to realize that Adelaide Farrow was not simply someone worth protecting. She was someone worth standing beside. The crisis came on the last night of November. It was a Friday, and James had finished his evening patrol and was heading back toward the jailhouse when he heard shouting from the direction of Adelaide's property. He turned his horse immediately and rode hard, his hand already on his revolver. He arrived to find Victor Crane standing at Adelaide's front gate with Booth Ragland beside him and two other ranch hands behind. Adelaide was on her porch. She had a lantern in one hand, and her expression was the calmest James had ever seen it, which meant she was frightened and was not going to show it. "I am telling you one final time," Crane was saying, his voice controlled but with something hard beneath it, "that a physician operating in this territory requires the approval of the County Health Board, and I am on that board. Your presence on that board does not give you authority over my credentials," Adelaide said. Her voice did not shake. "I am fully licensed by the territory of New Mexico. You have no legal basis for this." "I have the basis of community concern," Crane said. "There are questions about your methods." James rode up and dismounted. Every man in the group turned to look at him. Ragland's jaw tightened. "Evening, Victor," James said pleasantly. "Something I can help with, Deputy," Crane said. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when I hear shouting at night," James said. He walked past Crane and positioned himself at the base of Adelaide's porch steps, facing outward. It was a deliberate and unmistakable gesture. "Miss Farrow, is this trouble you need assistance with?" "Mr. Crane was just leaving," Adelaide said. Crane stared at James for a long moment. There was real anger in his eyes, the anger of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted and was encountering an obstacle he had not anticipated. "You should think carefully about your allegiances, Deputy," he said. "I think about them constantly," James said. "Good night, Victor." There was a long silence. Then Crane put his hat on and walked away, and Ragland and the others followed, and the sound of horses disappearing into the dark was the most welcome sound James had heard all year. He turned around. Adelaide was still standing on the porch with the lantern, and now that Crane was gone, some of the controlled calm had left her face and been replaced by something more honest. She looked shaken. Not broken, never broken, but shaken. "Are you all right?" he asked. She sat down on the porch steps and set the lantern beside her. "He wants my practice closed," she said. "He came to tell me that if I don't agree to work exclusively for him, he will find a way to have my license questioned." James sat down beside her on the steps. The night was very cold and very clear, and the stars above the valley were extraordinary. "He can file a complaint," he said, "but your credentials are legitimate. It would take time and legal maneuvering, but he couldn't actually." "He doesn't need to actually do anything," she said, her voice quiet. "He just needs people to start questioning. Once the questions start, they don't stop," James said. She looked at him. "He is a very dangerous man." "Yes," James said. "He is." They sat side by side on her porch steps in the cold night, and he was aware of how close she was, close enough that the warmth of her arm registered against his even through their coats. He was aware of it in a way that was becoming difficult to ignore. "Why does he want me specifically?" she asked. "He could hire a physician from anywhere." "Because he wants to own everything in this valley," James said. "Every resource, every service, every source of help that the people here depend on. You represent something he can't own yet. And that bothers him." She absorbed this. Then she said quietly, "I'm not for sale." "I know," he said. The words hung in the cold air for a moment. He did not mean them only literally, and she knew that, and he knew that she knew. And neither of them did anything about it except sit there on the porch steps looking at the stars while the night got colder, and neither one of them moved to go inside. He left eventually. He had to. But he rode back toward the jailhouse with his jaw set, and something burning in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but was something fiercer than either. A ferocious, focused determination. He had watched Crane hurt people for years. He was not going to watch him hurt her. The following 2 weeks were quiet in the way that the sky gets quiet before a hard storm. Crane made no more direct visits to Adelaide's property. Ragland was seen in town but caused no visible trouble. Adelaide continued her practice. James continued his patrols. But the tension was there, underneath everything, like a current under still water, and something else was there too. Something neither of them was naming but both of them were feeling. It surfaced on a Wednesday evening in mid-December, when James came by after his patrol and found Adelaide in the kitchen making coffee. And he sat at her table, and she poured 2 cups and sat across from him. And the conversation that usually flowed easily between them stalled for the first time. They sat there for a moment not saying anything, and the silence had a different quality to it than silence usually had, charged, careful, full of things that were present but unspoken. "James," she said finally. "Adelaide," he said at the same moment. They both stopped. He made himself hold her gaze even though everything in him was suggesting it might be safer not to. "I want to be honest with you about something," she said. "Please," he said. The word came out with more feeling than he intended. She looked at her coffee cup and then at him. "I have been very careful since I came here not to allow certain things to happen. I've worked too hard and fought too long to let anything complicate what I'm trying to build." She paused. "I am finding it difficult to be careful around you." The kitchen was very warm. The oil lamp on the table made the room amber and close. He was aware of every detail with the kind of heightened clarity that comes in moments that matter. "I'm finding it difficult too," he said. "I don't know if that's wise," she said. "It probably isn't," he agreed. "I'm a deputy in a town where the most powerful man already views you as a threat. Anything that links us more closely gives him more to use against you." She looked at him very directly. "Is that the only reason it might not be wise?" He took a breath. "No," he said. "I'm 34 years old, and I've spent 11 years making myself useful in a place, and I've never been particularly good at the kind of things that have nothing to do with being useful." He paused. "I'm not sure what I have to offer someone like you." "Someone like me," she said with an edge that was not unkind. "What does that mean?" "Someone who is extraordinary," he said simply. The word dropped between them like a stone into still water, and the ripples went everywhere. Adelaide Farrow, who had argued with school boards and medical committees and skeptical colleagues and a cattle baron with a grudge, looked at James Aldridge and seemed, for a moment, entirely at a loss. "James," she said, very softly. He reached across the table and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her, outside of a handshake 6 weeks ago, and the contact was electric and devastating and completely, absolutely right. "I know the timing is terrible," he said. "It's catastrophic timing," she agreed, but she did not take her hand away. "And I know Crane is already watching. He is. And I know that having the deputy publicly associated with you is either protection or provocation depending on which way the wind blows." "Also true," she said. "But I would like," he said carefully, "to be in your life in a way that is more than professional, if you are willing to consider that." She looked at him for a long time. The lamp flame reflected in her green eyes. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the first real cold of winter. "I am willing to consider it," she said. He did not know, in that moment, how little time they had before everything got very much harder. He did not know that 4 days later, everything would break open in the worst possible way. He only knew that she had not taken her hand away, and that this was the most hope he had carried in longer than he could precisely remember. On Sunday the 18th of December, Victor Crane was found dead in his study at his main ranch house. The report reached town at 6 in the morning. James was at the jailhouse when Ragland rode in, and he could tell from the expression on Ragland's face that whatever had happened was going to be significantly worse than a simple death. Crane had been shot. Once, through the chest, with a small caliber bullet. The door to his study had been locked from the inside, which meant whoever had done it had come through the window. The study window faced the east pasture. Crane's body had been found by one of his ranch hands when he didn't appear for breakfast. James rode out immediately, and he examined the scene with careful precision. The window was indeed the entry point. There were boot prints in the mud below it, small boots, notably smaller than Ragland's or any of the ranch hands. The shot had been fired at close range. A small caliber pistol, likely a Derringer or a pocket revolver. He made his notes. He asked his questions. He kept his expression professionally neutral. And then Booth Ragland said, with a face that was extremely carefully arranged to look grieved rather than calculating, "One of the men saw a woman riding away from the eastern pasture around midnight. We think it was that woman doctor from town." James's pen stopped moving in his notebook. "What makes you say that?" he asked. "Red hair," Ragland said. "Riding a chestnut horse." James wrote this down. He kept his face very still. Adelaide Farrow had dark auburn hair. She rode a chestnut mare. He wrote this down and said nothing else. He rode back to town. He went to Adelaide's property. He knocked on her door at 8 in the morning, and when she answered it she was already dressed, already watching him with those careful eyes that saw everything. "Victor Crane is dead," he said. Something passed across her face, not shock, not guilt, but something more complex. Knowledge, recognition. "When?" she asked. "Last night. Around midnight is what they're estimating." "Come inside," she said. He came inside. She sat across from him at the kitchen table again, and the table that had been the site of warmth and honesty 2 evenings ago now felt like something considerably more fraught. "Where were you last night?" he asked. He asked it quietly, not as an accusation, but he asked it. "Here," she said. "I had a patient at 6, young Tom Greer with a fever. He left around 8. After that I was alone. I went to bed at 10 and I didn't hear anything until your knock just now." She met his eyes squarely. "I did not kill Victor Crane." "I know you didn't," he said. "Do you?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "But someone wants it to look like you did." The recognition in her face deepened. "Ragland. Or someone instructed by Ragland," James said. "Crane's death might not even be what it looks like." If Ragland wanted control of Crane's operation, he needed Crane gone, Adelaide said slowly, and he needed a plausible person to blame. "Someone new to town," James said. "Someone Crane was known to have had conflict with. Someone without deep roots in the community who could be discredited." "Someone like me," she said, and there was an edge in her voice that was careful and cold, the edge of someone who has been targeted before and knows what it feels like. James stood up and paced the small kitchen. He was thinking hard. He needed to handle this exactly right, which meant he needed to handle this in a way that was legally proper, while simultaneously ensuring that a frame-up did not result in a woman he cared about deeply being hanged for a murder she didn't commit. "I'm going to have to take a statement from you officially," he said. "And I am going to have to tell the sheriff everything I found at the scene, including Ragland's claim about the woman." "And then?" she asked. "And then I am going to find out what actually happened," he said. "James." Her voice was low and serious. "If Ragland controls what the witnesses say, he might," James said. "Which is why we need something he doesn't control, physical evidence, something at the scene that contradicts the story he's building. He went back to the Crane Ranch that afternoon with a more systematic approach. He examined the mud under the window more carefully. He measured the boot prints. He looked at the angle of the shot relative to Crane's position in the chair. He talked to 3 of the ranch hands separately, one at a time, and he asked them the same questions in slightly different orders and watched their answers to see which ones were consistent and which ones had been rehearsed. 2 of the 3 told the same story in suspiciously identical language. The third one, a young Mexican cowhand named Tomás who looked terrified to be questioned at all, told James that he had not actually seen any woman, and that Ragland had told them all what to say the morning after Crane's death, before James arrived. James wrote this down very carefully. He asked Tomás if he would be willing to testify to this. Tomás looked at his boots for a long time. Then he said, "If you can keep me safe from Ragland." James made no promises he could not keep, which meant he said, "I will do everything in my power," which was the truest thing he could say. But it was not enough. The county sheriff, a man named Fowler who was 10 years from retirement and had been accommodating Crane's influence for most of them, reviewed James's report and declined to pursue any alternative theory. He said the circumstantial evidence pointed clearly toward Adelaide Farrow. He said a formal charge would be filed. He said the territorial marshal's office had already been notified. James sat across from Sheriff Fowler's desk and felt, for the first time in his career, a profound contempt for the institution he served. He did not let it show. He kept his voice even. He said that there were significant problems with the existing evidence and that he believed the investigation was being closed prematurely. Fowler said, "Noted, Deputy," in the voice of a man who does not intend to note anything at all. Adelaide was formally arrested 2 days before Christmas. James was at her property when the sheriff came with the papers. He watched her face go through a rapid, controlled sequence of emotions: shock, anger, grief, and then, within 30 seconds, a fierce, composed determination. She asked if she could bring her medical journal. Fowler said she could. She picked it up and held it under her arm and walked out with her head up and her back straight. And James rode alongside them to town and helped her into the jailhouse with a gentleness that was entirely outside his official duties and entirely impossible to suppress. That first night, he sat outside her cell on a wooden chair and they talked through the bars. It was not romantic. It was the opposite of romantic. It was stark and frightening and real. But there was something in it that was deeper than romantic. There was an absolute and complete honesty, the honesty that comes when there is no room left for anything else. "My journal," she said, holding it through the bars. "The records I kept, Crane's visit, what he said to me, the injuries from his ranch hands, the dates, all of it." He took the journal. He read it that night. He read it twice. It was extraordinarily detailed and meticulously documented. It contained evidence of Crane's coercive behavior, of the injuries sustained by his workers, of the threats made against Adelaide. It also contained notes, written in Adelaide's precise medical handwriting, about 3 separate patients she had treated on the night of Crane's death, including young Tom Greer, who had left her property at 8 in the evening and would confirm this. It was not a confession. It was the opposite of a confession. And it was, James believed, enough, combined with Tomás's potential testimony and his own investigation, to create serious, reasonable doubt. But the judge assigned to the case was not the county judge. Because of the high-profile nature of the case, and because of Crane's political connections, the trial had been moved to a higher authority. It was going to be presided over by Judge Harlan Cobb, who was known throughout the territory as a man of strict adherence to procedure and not always equal adherence to justice. James spent the 2 weeks between Adelaide's arrest and her trial doing three things simultaneously. He continued his deputy duties so that Fowler would not have grounds to suspend him. He built his alternative case with every shred of evidence available to him, and he visited Adelaide every single day. Those visits were their relationship in its truest and most essential form. There was no pretense possible. They could not pretend to be merely professional acquaintances. They could not perform casual friendship. They sat on opposite sides of iron bars in a cold jailhouse in December, and they were entirely, terrifyingly honest with each other. "Tell me what you're afraid of," she said one afternoon, when the cold light through the small jailhouse window had turned gray and the cell was full of shadows. He thought about lying. He decided against it. "That it won't be enough," he said. "That the evidence I've gathered, and Tomas's testimony, and the journal, that Cobb will accept Raglan's constructed narrative instead. That the fact of your being a woman who challenges the established order will be held against you in ways that are never stated but are always present." She was quiet for a moment. "That is exactly what I am afraid of," she said. "I know," he said, "and you're still trying." "I will not stop trying," he said. She reached through the bars and took his hand, reversing the gesture he had made at her kitchen table 2 weeks before. Her fingers were cold. He held them and looked at her through the iron bars between them, and the emotion in his chest was so immense and so complicated that he could not have named all of it if he tried. There was love. He had stopped pretending to himself that it wasn't, and there was rage on her behalf, and there was fear, and beneath all of it, steady as the floor they stood on, there was an absolute certainty that he was not going to stop. He gathered additional testimony from Tom Greer, who confirmed he had been at Adelaide's property until 8 in the evening, and that she had been alone and showed no signs of going anywhere. He found a stable hand at Crane's ranch who confirmed that on the night of the murder, Ragland had been in the barn late, unusually late, and that the ranch's most reliable rifle was missing for 3 days before reappearing in the gun rack. He found a merchant in Las Cruces who confirmed that a small pistol consistent with the one that had fired the fatal shot had been purchased 2 weeks before the murder by a man matching Ragland's description. It was not a complete case, but it was considerably more than nothing. He wrote it all up. He put it together as a formal report, cross-referenced with Adelaide's journal entries. He sent copies to the territorial marshal's office in Santa Fe with a cover letter that carefully and precisely explained why he believed the prosecution's case was built on manufactured evidence. He did not know if the marshal's office would act in time. He was not even certain they would act at all. He sent the letter because he believed in records, and then the trial arrived. It was the 7th of January, 1883, and the courthouse in Redemption Creek was packed with every person in the county who could get there. Judge Cobb had come down from Santa Fe. The prosecutor, Dillard, had also come from Santa Fe, which told James immediately that Crane's political connections reached further than the county. Ragland sat in the gallery behind Alina Crane, who sat in the front row in black silk. Adelaide was brought in wearing the blue dress she had been arrested in, which had been cleaned and pressed by someone. James suspected Mrs. Gurney, and her hair was pinned neatly, and she walked with her back straight and her chin up, and James watched her from the gallery with his jaw tight and his hands clasped together, and something burning in his chest that was both overwhelming and entirely, desperately focused. The trial proceeded badly from the beginning. Dillard was skilled, and the witnesses who testified to seeing a red-haired woman on a chestnut horse were consistent, clearly rehearsed, and convincingly presented. Ragland himself testified, grieved and controlled, about finding Crane's body. The coroner confirmed the time and manner of death. The boot prints, measured and documented, were presented as matching Adelaide's boots. And here James's jaw tightened further, because he knew those prints had been planted, but proving it was not simple. Adelaide's court-appointed attorney was a young man named Porter who was doing his best and was clearly outmatched. He challenged the witness testimony competently. He introduced Tom Greer's alibi evidence. He entered Adelaide's journal into the record. It was not enough. James could see it was not enough. He had been sitting in the gallery for 2 hours. He had watched the trial turn against her with the slow inevitability of a tide. He had seen Cobb's face as he reviewed each piece of evidence, and the judge's expression was that of a man who found the existing narrative convenient. James Aldridge had been a lawman for 11 years. He had worked within systems that were broken and had done it quietly and with the patience of a man who believed in gradual, documented progress. He had filed reports. He had kept records. He had operated precisely within the lines of what his position allowed, and had never, not once, asked the law to bend on his behalf. He was about to ask it to bend. He stood up. He walked down from the gallery to the floor of the courtroom. He heard the murmur start as people recognized him. He walked past the rows of Crane's men and the townspeople and Mrs. Gurney, who looked at him with an expression that was terrified and hopeful simultaneously. When Dillard rose to object, James had already reached the front of the room. When the judge raised his gavel, James was already facing him. He pulled off his hat, he took a breath, and he said it. "I will vouch for her with my name." The silence that followed was absolute. Judge Cobb leaned forward. "Deputy Aldridge, you understand what you are doing?" "Yes, sir," James said. "I do." "You understand that vouching for this woman, putting your name and your badge and your reputation behind her claim of innocence, means that if this court finds reason to doubt her—" "Then the doubt falls on me," James said. "Yes, sir, I understand." "The law does not formally recognize personal vouching in criminal cases, Deputy," Dillard said, his voice tight with controlled outrage. "No," James agreed. "But the law does recognize new evidence, and I have new evidence. And I am formally requesting, as a sworn officer of this county, that I be permitted to present it before this court renders its verdict." The silence stretched. Judge Cobb looked at James with those storm cloud eyes, and James met the look without blinking. "The court," Cobb said slowly, "will hear the deputy's evidence." He pointed his gavel at Dillard before the man could speak. "This is my courtroom. Sit down." What happened in the next 45 minutes would be talked about in Redemption Creek for years afterward. James presented his evidence systematically and without flourish. He presented his own investigative report, dated and signed, detailing the inconsistencies in the boot print measurements and the angle of the fatal shot relative to the window entry point. He called Tamaz the cowhand, who had been brought from the Crane Ranch under James's quiet personal guarantee of protection, and who testified, visibly frightened but steady, that Ragland had told all the hands what to say before the deputy arrived the morning after the murder. He entered the Las Cruces merchant's statement about the pistol purchase. He entered the stable hand's account of Ragland's unusual nighttime presence in the barn and the missing rifle. Then he held up Adelaide's medical journal. "This journal," he said, speaking directly to Judge Cobb, "contains dated records of every patient Miss Farrow treated from the day she arrived in this town. It contains records of injuries sustained by Victor Crane's ranch workers that are inconsistent with accidental causes. It contains a dated record of a direct threat made by Crane himself against Miss Farrow's livelihood. and it contains records of the 3 patients she treated on the evening of December 18th, including Tom Greer, who left her property at 8 in the evening and has testified that she was alone at her property and showed no signs of going anywhere. He set the journal on the judge's bench. The prosecution's case rests on the testimony of witnesses who have already admitted under oath to being directed in their account by the primary suspect in this murder, Booth Ragland, who had clear motive, clear opportunity, and a documented history of violent behavior toward others. The physical evidence does not support the narrative that a woman of Miss Farrow's height and weight made entry through that window at that angle. The alibi evidence is documented and corroborated. He paused. Miss Farrow did not kill Victor Crane. Booth Ragland killed Victor Crane. And someone in this room has known that from the moment the body was found. He looked at Ragland when he said this last part. Ragland's face went very still, and in that stillness was everything James needed to see. Judge Cobb studied the journal. He studied the reports. His clerk brought him additional pages, and he read those too. The courtroom was so quiet that James could hear the wind outside and the heartbeat of the crowd. Then Cobb looked up. He looked at Ragland. He said, "I am going to ask you directly, Mr. Ragland, and you are going to understand that you are still under oath. Did you instruct your men in what to say before the deputy arrived on the morning of December 19th? Ragland opened his mouth, closed it. He was calculating. James could see it. Calculating whether Tomas's word against his could hold, whether the other hands would contradict Tomas, whether the merchant's statement about the pistol was truly damning. In that moment of calculation, Tomas said clearly from his seat, in accented but perfectly comprehensible English, "He did. He told us all exactly what to say. He said it was a woman with red hair on a chestnut horse, and we were all to say we saw her." One of the other hands, a man who had been sitting rigidly straight throughout the trial, suddenly looked at his boots, and then he said quietly, "That's true. That's what he told us." Ragland's chair scraped back. He was on his feet. And then James was moving too, because he had spent 11 years as a lawman, and he knew what it looked like when a man was about to run. He caught Ragland before he reached the door. 3 spectators who had been standing in the back helped, and it was undignified and loud and not at all like the clean resolution of stories. But within 60 seconds, Ragland was being restrained and the courtroom was in an uproar. Judge Cobb's gavel came down hard, once, twice, 3 times. "Order," he said, "order in this court." The noise subsided slowly. Ragland was held. His face was furious and frightened. Cobb looked at the room for a long, still moment. Then he looked at Adelaide. "Miss Farrow," he said, "the charges against you are dismissed. You are released from custody immediately." He looked at the prosecutor. "Dillard, I am recommending to the marshal's office that Mr. Ragland be held on charges of murder and subornation of perjury. I will be making a full report." He looked at James last. "Deputy Aldridge, your conduct today was irregular." "Yes, sir," James said. "It was also," the judge said, with the closest thing to an expression of reluctant respect James had ever seen on that face, "correct. The court is adjourned." The gavel came down. The iron cuffs came off Adelaide's wrists. She stood in the sudden release of the moment, her hands free, rubbing her wrists where the metal had marked them. The room was in motion around her, people talking, Ragland being removed, the judge gathering papers, Alina Crane sitting utterly still in the front row with an expression of someone whose careful constructed world had just been disassembled around her. James crossed the floor to Adelaide. He stopped in front of her. She looked at him, and what was in her eyes was not something that could be easily described. Relief so profound it was almost painful, and gratitude that went beyond words, and something else, something larger, something that he had seen building for weeks in kitchen conversations and porch evenings and jailhouse visits, and had been afraid to name. "James," she said. Her voice cracked on just his name. "Adelaide," he said. She stepped forward and put her arms around him, and he held her in the middle of that courthouse with the whole town watching. And she pressed her face against his chest, and he held her tight. And they stood like that for a moment that lasted longer than it needed to and exactly as long as it should. Mrs. Gurney, from somewhere in the crowd, made a sound that was very close to a sob. The weeks that followed the trial were the most significant restructuring of Redemption Creek's political landscape in a decade. Booth Ragland was transported to Santa Fe to stand trial for the murder of Victor Crane, and the additional testimony from the ranch hands, who, freed from Ragland's intimidation and facing their own potential charges for perjury, spoke with considerable more honesty, made the case against him thorough and damning. He was convicted in March of 1883 and sentenced to life imprisonment. Lena Crane, who had known nothing of the murder and quite a lot about her husband's business practices, found herself in the complicated position of a wealthy widow whose wealth was largely built on coercion. She sold 2 of the 3 ranches and returned to her family in the East. The land went back to the market. Several small ranching families acquired parcels they had never been able to afford while Crane was alive. The county health board, without Crane's influence, had absolutely no grounds to question Adelaide Farrow's credentials. They also had no grounds to question her judgment, her methods, or her right to practice. Her practice became, within 3 months of the trial, the most trusted medical facility within a 60-mile radius. And James Aldridge, who had put his name on the line for her in a courthouse full of people, found that his name in the community carried more weight afterward than it ever had before. The territorial marshal's office sent a letter commending his investigative work. Several of the small ranching families wrote to the county commission recommending his promotion to sheriff when Fowler retired, which Fowler did quietly in February. But these were the official, external developments. The more important ones were smaller and quieter. He was at her door on the first evening after the trial, still in his court clothes with his hat in his hand, and she opened the door before he could knock because she had heard his horse, because she was always paying attention. "Come in," she said. He came in. She poured coffee without asking. They sat at the kitchen table that had been the site of so much honesty between them. The oil lamp made the room amber and warm. Outside, it was January and cold, and the mountains to the east were white with snow against a black sky full of stars. "I need to say something to you," he said. "Yes," she said. She was watching him with those steady green eyes. "I should have said it earlier," he said. "I kept finding reasons to wait until things were more settled, more appropriate. But things were never going to be settled, and I think we have both been too careful about appropriate for too long." She pressed her lips together, and something in her expression was very warm. "I love you," he said. "I want to say it plainly, because I have been spending too much energy on not saying it plainly. And I'm tired of that. And also because you are the most extraordinary person I have ever known, and it seems dishonest not to say so." Adelaide Farrow, who had argued with medical committees and powerful cattle barons and a county judge without flinching, had to take a breath before she could answer. "I love you too," she said. "I have been in love with you since approximately the evening you sat on my porch steps in the cold and told me to document everything, which is not a typical moment for falling in love, but appears to have been sufficient." He laughed. It was a genuine laugh, deep and surprised, and she laughed too. and the sound of both of them laughing together in that kitchen was better than anything James Aldridge could remember in a very long time. He reached across the table again, and she gave him her hand again, and this time there were no bars between them and no crisis waiting in the immediate distance and no reasons to be careful. And he was grateful for all of this with an intensity that he suspected would not diminish for a very long time. He asked her to marry him in March, on a Sunday afternoon when the first spring was beginning to show in the valley, green coming up along the creek bank, and the mountains losing their white gradually. And he did it simply, without theatrical gestures, standing in her kitchen with his hat on the table. He told her he understood if she was not interested in marriage, that he respected the independence she had built and had no intention of diminishing it, and that he was asking not to change her life but to join it. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Then she told him not to qualify things so much, that she had known what she wanted since January, and he was welcome to assume it hadn't changed. They were married in April at the small church at the end of Redemption Creek's Main Street, with every person in town in attendance and Mrs. Gurney playing the piano with her healed and properly set wrist, which she did magnificently, because she had been playing every day since Adelaide had reset it, and she was not going to waste the gift. The ceremony was brief and entirely sincere, and when James took Adelaide's hands in his and said his vows, his voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they are absolutely certain. And when she said hers, looking at him without the careful composure of a woman managing the world's perceptions, but simply as herself, he understood that this was the most significant moment of his life, and that he would remember every detail of it forever. Sheriff James Aldridge. He had accepted the appointment in February and had taken the title with characteristic quietness. And Adelaide Farrow Aldridge settled into a life that was full and complicated and frequently exhausting and deeply happy. Adelaide expanded her medical practice through the summer. She took on an assistant, a young woman named Clara who had some nursing training and a fierce interest in learning more, and together they extended their range to make visits to outlying ranches and farms where travel to town was difficult. Adelaide delivered babies and set bones and treated fevers and educated her patients about preventive measures, and she kept records of everything, always, in journals that filled a growing shelf in her clinic. James ran the sheriff's office with the same methodical patience he had always brought to the work, and with considerably more authority to act on it. He pursued Crane's old cases with renewed energy, and found that without Crane's money and influence blocking the legal avenues, several situations that had been stuck for years resolved in the right direction. Small ranching families received legal acknowledgement of land claims that had been disputed for years. Water rights that had been tied up in manufactured paperwork were properly reassigned. The valley, gradually, became less fearful. He also kept the box of reports under his desk. He kept adding to it. Old habits are kept because they are right, not because they are easy. In October of 1883, exactly 1 year after Adelaide had first ridden into Redemption Creek on a chestnut mare with a broken saddle strap, she told James she was pregnant. She told him in the clinic at the end of a long day, with the practical directness that was one of the things he loved most about her, sitting in the chair behind her desk with her journal in front of her and her reading spectacles on. He stood very still for a moment. Then he sat down in the patient's chair across from her desk and looked at her and felt something enormous and uncomplicated move through him. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Tired," she said honestly, "and rather overwhelmed and very glad." "Me too," he said. "All three." She smiled at him with her whole face, not the careful partial smile she deployed in public, but the real one, the one that was only for him, that had taken months to earn, and that he never took for granted. Their son was born in June of 1884, on a Tuesday morning when the summer had come fully into the valley, and the air smelled like sage and heated stone. Adelaide delivered with the assistance of Clara and the cool professional calm of a woman who had guided other people through this experience and knew exactly what was happening, while James sat in the parlor of their house and was not calm at all. They named him Henry. He was large and healthy and almost immediately opinionated, characteristics that James observed with considerable amusement, and Adelaide observed with the resignation of someone who recognized traits she had met before. Henry grew up understanding that his mother was the physician who made people well and his father was the sheriff who kept the peace, and that both of these things mattered, and both required dedication and honesty. He grew up watching them work and watching them love each other with the particular quality of love that has been tested and has not broken. 2 years after Henry came a daughter, Margaret, who arrived with the same decisive energy as her brother and immediately began competing with him for territory. The Aldrich household was loud and full and warm, and James, who had spent 11 years in a bachelor's jailhouse going over wanted notices alone, thought about this sometimes and felt a gratitude that was almost hard to contain. There were still difficult things. The territory was still rough country, and the law was still an imperfect instrument. Adelaide still encountered doubt and dismissal from men who could not accept what she was. James still dealt with violence and injustice, and the slow, frustrating machinery of systems that preferred the comfortable lie to the inconvenient truth. But they dealt with these things together. They sat at the kitchen table that had always been the place for honest things, and they talked, and they kept records, and they did not stop trying. In the spring of 1886, 3 years after the trial that had reshaped both their lives, Adelaide received a letter from the Missouri Medical College asking her to contribute a paper on frontier medicine practices for a medical journal they were publishing. The letter referenced her reputation in the territory as an example of effective rural medical practice. She showed James the letter over breakfast. He read it and set it down and looked at her with an expression that was quietly, thoroughly proud. "You should write it," he said. "I intend to," she said. "I'm going to include everything: the documentation practices, the preventive approach, the importance of trust between a physician and a community." She paused. "I'm going to mention the trial." He looked at her. "I'm going to explain," she said, "that the documentation habits I developed were what made it possible to refute a false accusation. That records matter. That the truth accumulates until it can't be ignored." She met his eyes across the breakfast table, with Henry eating noisily beside them and Margaret attempting to steal Henry's biscuit. "That's true, isn't it?" "Yes," James said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "It's completely true." She turned her hand under his and held it. The kitchen was warm and full of the noise of their children and the smell of coffee and the light of a spring morning coming through the windows. "I think I will also mention," Adelaide said, "that it helps to have someone willing to walk into a courtroom and put their name on the line for you." "Only if it's the truth," he said. "It's the most important truth in the paper," she said. He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had ridden into his town on a chestnut mare with a broken saddle strap and had, in the space of a year, saved his life just as thoroughly as he had saved hers, though neither of them would have put it exactly that way. She had saved him from becoming a man who believed in records, but had forgotten why records mattered. She had reminded him that the law was only as good as the people who were willing to stand up for it when it was inconvenient, and that standing up for someone was not an act of weakness but the purest form of strength. "Write it exactly like that," he said. She squeezed his hand. Margaret successfully stole Henry's biscuit. Henry protested at considerable volume. Adelaide rose to settle the dispute with the particular efficient calm of a woman who managed crises for a living. And James sat at his kitchen table in the spring morning and felt, with a completeness that had no remainder, that his life was exactly what it should be. The paper was published in October of 1886. It was well received. 3 other frontier physicians wrote to Adelaide as a result, and a modest correspondence began, a small network of medical professionals in isolated territories sharing knowledge across the enormous distances between them. James received his appointment as county sheriff by formal commission in November. He accepted it with the same quiet he had brought to the deputy's badge, because the work did not change according to the title. The work was what it always had been, being present, being honest, keeping records, and standing up when standing up was required. He still had the box of old reports under the desk. He had added a second box. Henry Aldridge, at 3½, had taken to following his father around the sheriff's office on Saturday mornings when Adelaide was seeing patients, and James brought him along rather than have him underfoot in the clinic. Henry sat in the deputy's chair. James had appointed an actual deputy now, a steady young man named Frank Carroll, and pretended to read the wanted notices with enormous seriousness. James watched his son pretend to read the notices and thought of himself at 23, drifting into a town during a hard winter and deciding to stay because it felt like a place that needed staying in. He thought of Adelaide riding in on that October Tuesday and asking about available land with a directness that was so clear and so certain it was like a bell being struck. He thought of a courthouse full of people and a gavel striking and the sound of his own voice saying words that had changed everything. He thought, "I would say them again. I would say them 100 times. For her, and for Henry, and for Margaret, and for the truth, and for the conviction that some things are worth the cost of standing up for them even when you don't know how it will end." He would say them every time. On a warm evening in August of 1887, when the valley was at its most beautiful, green and gold, and shadowed by the mountains in the long light of a summer sunset, James and Adelaide sat on the porch of their house, the house they had built together on the east side of town, not far from the clinic, on the land that had once been Harkin's property that she had first leased and they had later bought. Henry was inside with Margaret, and the sounds coming through the open window were the sounds of children who were extremely alive and extremely well. Adelaide had a new journal open in her lap. She was always in the middle of some documentation, and James had a coffee cup that was no longer warm and which he had not gotten up to refill, because getting up would mean moving, and not moving was currently the most appealing option available to him. The mountains were turning that old copper color that he associated with October, but it was August, and it happened sometimes in the evenings when the light was exactly right. "James," Adelaide said, without looking up from her journal. "Adelaide," he said. "I'm going to need a larger cabinet for the clinic," she said. "I'm running out of storage for the medicine inventory." "I'll speak to the carpenter on Monday," he said. "And Clara wants to take on an additional patient day. She's ready for it." "Good," he said. "She's been ready for a while." A pause. The evening settled around them, warm and still. "I'm expecting again," she said. He turned his head and looked at her. She was still looking at her journal, but the corner of her mouth was doing something very specific. "When?" he asked. "February, if my calculations are right." "They usually are." He set down the coffee cup. He turned in his chair to face her properly. She finally looked up from the journal and met his eyes, and in her face was the same thing that had been there the first time, that private full smile that was only for him, that had never stopped being the best thing he had seen all day. "A larger cabinet," he said. "And an additional patient day for Clara, and a baby in February." "Yes," she said, "that appears to be where we are." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat together on their porch in the evening of that August day, with the mountains going copper behind them and their children loud and alive inside, and the valley they had both chosen, for different reasons and at different times, spread out before them in the last of the light. They had both come to this place carrying hard things. She had carried the weight of being excellent in a world that found her excellence inconvenient. He had carried 11 years of patient, quiet work, and the loneliness of a man who believes in something but has no one to believe in it with him. They had found each other in the middle of a crisis that could have destroyed her, and had instead, improbably, impossibly, become the beginning of everything worth having. He had put his name on the line for her. She had made his name worth more than it had ever been. Neither of them had planned any of it, and both of them, looking back, could not imagine any other way it could have gone. In February of 1888, their second son was born. They named him William. He was, from the first hour, even louder than Henry, which Adelaide had not thought physiologically possible. James took one look at him and said, very quietly, that William was going to be trouble. Adelaide looked at James over the head of the newborn and said that trouble was not always a bad thing, and that she had rather proved this herself. He laughed. She laughed. William, entirely unimpressed with the laughter of his parents, registered his displeasure with considerable volume. Henry, who had been waiting with extreme impatience outside the bedroom door, was allowed in to see his brother. He studied William with the grave seriousness of a 4-year-old conducting a formal assessment. Then he said, "He is very red." "He is very new," Adelaide said. "Margaret was red too," Henry said, reassured by this precedent. Margaret, 2 years old and escorted by James, looked at William with an expression that suggested she had not been informed this was happening and was reserving judgment. James looked at his family assembled in the bedroom of the house they had built together. In the town they both called home, in the valley that was better than it had been when either of them had arrived in it. And he felt something so complete and so solid that there was no word for it except simply right. He sat on the edge of the bed beside Adelaide and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and William continued to voice his opinions at full volume, and Henry explained to Margaret that babies did this, and it was normal. And outside the window, the February sky was clear and cold, and the mountains were white and beautiful. This was the life. This was all of it, and it was more than enough, and they had earned it together, with honesty and stubbornness and the willingness to stand up in a packed courtroom and say the truest and most important thing. "I will vouch for her with my name." He would say it again. He had already said it every day since, in ways that were small and daily and not dramatic, in showing up, in staying, in the coffee he brought her in the mornings before her first patient arrived, in the way he listened when she talked about her work, in the way she listened when he talked about his. In the records they both kept, in the children they were raising to be honest and to stand up for things that mattered. That was the vow that had really counted. Not only the one said in the church on an April afternoon, though that one had counted completely too. The one that said, "I see who you are, I believe in what you are, and I will put everything I have behind it." She had done the same for him. In her way, in her own particular fierce and clear-eyed way, she had looked at him and said, "You are enough, and you are the person I choose, and I am not afraid of what this costs." The mountains held the snow. The valley held the town. The town held their lives. And in the sheriff's house on the east side of Redemption Creek, on a cold February evening in 1888, everything was exactly, thoroughly, irreversibly right.